All right, so hello everyone. My name is Sarah Music. I'm the produce safety coordinator, and we are here for the registration webinar today. So here we go. So this is just the agenda. These are some of the things that we will be talking about. So we're going to go over registration, its requirements, who is and who is not QE or qualified exempt. We again will kind of go over that a little bit. There are exemptions to registering, or there might be just some little caveats as far as registering with the program. So we're going to touch on those as well, specifically micro exempt, commercial exempt, and discretionary exempt, but then also qualified exempt. So if at any point you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or come off mute. This is meant to be more of a conversation, so let's get started. So as far as registration, again, high level, it is a requirement. So this was something that was adopted when we brought the federal produce safety rule under state authority. So any farms that are considered covered, so if you're growing covered produce, if you're qualified exempt, commercial exempt, and even discretionary exempt, are all required to register with the program. It's a 10-minute process. There's no uploading of documents. We're going to kind of go through what are some little nuances with it, but it's just very basic information that we're asking for. You don't have to upload any sales records or anything along those lines. We wanted to make it as painless as possible. So why is registration important? So it's important, at least for us, it improves our program efficiency. So that way we know what is being grown in the state. And so that way we can kind of develop our education outreach accordingly. But then also we are federally funded. And one of the things that the FDA requires us to do is to report our aggregate data, specifically on what's being grown in the state. So this is something on a quarterly basis that we have to report. No names are given out, no addresses, none of that information, just high level. So how does that affect us is that FDA funds us based on the covered farms that we have in our inventory. So we want it to continue to be a state program. We are federally funded. So this helps us get more funding to be able to run our program. So I just went over why it was important for us for you to register. Well, why should you register, right? The why behind it. So we do send out a monthly newsletter. If you aren't on that list, let me know. I'd be more than happy to put you on it. And in our newsletter, yes, it is regulatory. We do have regulatory updates in there. However, we also have industry news, any conferences, any webinars, any information on grants, either through CDA or that we hear through our grapevine, our connections. So that way you have opportunities that you can be able to sign up for. And then also the other big one is with outbreaks, right? You know, they don't just affect that farm, it affects that whole industry. So having good contact information helps us if we were to ever, right, knock on wood, ever would need to do that. So it allows us to reach out to that area, that geographical location maybe. We have yet to have to do this, but again, helps us out if we have the correct information. And for you as well. So now we're going to kind of get into the registration process and then also the registration certificate. I'll be covering that here. So the registration process, again, it should only take 10 minutes. It shouldn't take any longer. We have an electronic version. So there's like a registration portal that you would just have to, if you hadn't signed up before, you can just sign up with your email and a password, get in there and select create. And then it just kind of walks you through all the different things that we're asking. The picture that you see on the right there, that's the paper form. It mimics the electronic one, but there were some things that we had to change a little bit. So that way the paper one wasn't 100 pages long. So one of them being on the electronic version, you'll see top fruits and vegetables that are grown in the state. We did that because we know a lot of farms are growing it. So then you can just select if you grow, harvest, pack, and hold, and move on. There is an other category. So if there's things not listed there that you also grow, you can put it in there as well. The paper version, we just didn't have the space for that. However, we do break it down to grow, harvest, pack, and hold, and you can write out exactly what you grow. So that's just a little bit different. And I'm going to mark in here. So, but the questions are still the same. If you're more comfortable doing the paper version, you're more than welcome to. I typically send it in our newsletter, the paper version. But if you prefer that way, you can either email it or snail mail works just as fine as well. The registration does start on November 1st, and we try to end it on December 31st, but we always are open to getting any kind of registrations after that point as well. We just would like to see your registration. So there are things that are asked in the registration that we kind of wanted to clarify because we have seen a lot of discrepancies or maybe there was some confusion. So we just wanted to clarify them a little bit. So the first ones are packing and holding. So what we mean by packing is even if you field pack, anything that you're putting into a harvest bin or even combining harvest bins would be considered packing. And especially if you're qualified exempt, you're probably packing. And then also, you're probably also holding too. The thing with holding is if it's just stored in one spot for no indeterminate amount of time. So if you harvest that morning, but then it sits there until the afternoon until your CSA members come and pick it up, that would be considered holding. The other big one would be if you have a cooler, you're holding. So those are the big ones that we just kind of wanted to emphasize because we've been seeing farms say, oh, I only grow and harvest, but then we'll do an inspection. It's like, well, you actually also pack and hold as well. So if you have any questions on that or what your process is and if it would be considered either one of these, feel free to let me know. I'd be happy to walk you through that. The PSA grower training. So that's the Produce Safety Alliance grower training. It is, if you've taken it, you would have gotten something similar to this. Oh, I don't know if it can focus. You would have gotten one of these manuals. There's 8 modules that you go through. If you've done it in person, it's a 8-hour day, maybe had stretched into 8.5. If it was virtual, it was probably over 2 days. So that's what we mean by a PSA grower training. We do ask this question during the registration process. So that's what we're asking for. The reason why is all covered farms are required to take this training. At least someone on the farm has to take it. So that's what we're talking about. We've just seen some discrepancies with that where they answer yes in one part, but then say no. So if you're not sure, you would have also gotten a certificate through your email, or if it was before 2020, a paper in the mail. As far as food safety third-party audits, what we mean by this is we're not talking about if I have come out to your farm and done on-farm readiness review or an educational visit or anything along those lines. I have seen in that area where people will just say, Sarah Music came out to my farm for an audit. I don't do audits. So just wanting to make sure that we clarify what that is. This person. So a food safety third party, typically what we see is if you get a audit through the fruit and veg down in Monte Vista, that's a third party audit. So it would be like a good agricultural practice, so GAP or HGAP, Primus, SQF, Global GAP, any of those, that's what we're talking about for third party audits. Now, why are we asking this? Well, we try to, when we're getting our inspections aligned, trying to coordinate to make sure that, oh, okay, if they're getting a GAP audit, can we also just piggyback with the produce safety inspection? So it's just a way for us to be able to coordinate our efforts so that way we're not taking up too much of your time if we can, right? We try to work with growers as much as we can. Sometimes it's just not avoidable. So that's what we mean by third party. If you're curious as to what it is, feel free to let me know. I can go into more in depth of if you are actually getting what we would consider a food safety or third-party audit. I'm going to cover qualified and commercial exempt a little bit later, just going through all the different details, but wanted to list them here. And then an on-farm readiness review. I've had some people click, there is a question on there if you would like an on-farm readiness review. And some people say, oh, I just clicked that because I didn't know what it was and didn't know and wanted more information. So an on-farm readiness review is an educational visit, or you may have heard it as like a mock inspection. So what it is I would come out, it's purely educational. We do also offer this for qualified exempt farms, especially if you are hitting a certain threshold where you might be a fully covered farm, and just kind of wanting to see where's compliance under the produce safety rule in my operation. Are we close? Where do we need to work on? What are some things that an inspector might see that I might have to, beef up in my own operation? So that's what an on-farm readiness review. If you're interested, there is a question on the registration form about that, or feel free to reach out to me directly if that's something you're interested. Either way works. So the registration process. So if you fill it out electronically, you press done, and then you'll get a confirmation email saying, thank you for registering with the program, blah, 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 right? So then that way you know that you filled it out, it's been completed. Then the next step is, it's typically me, but it doesn't have to be. Someone looks at it. And what we do is we look at the registration form and compare it to the information that we have in our farm inventory. And if there's any discrepancies, we'll be reaching out. So typically what it is if, like the example here, if you had put watermelons that you were growing, harvesting, and packing watermelons, and then you didn't have it on your registration form this year, I may reach out and just go, hey, saw that you had watermelons. Are you doing that? Sometimes it's an honest mistake, which is fine. Or sometimes they're just like, yeah, they just, it's not in our rotation this year, which again is also fine. But then we can update our inventory to reflect that information. So confirming that information, what's new is a qualified exempt form. Again, just wanted to touch on it here. I'll go into more in depth of what that looks like and what that process looks like a little bit later. Now, if everything looks good, addresses match, contacts match, all of that, then you will get a registration certificate, and we will touch on that in a couple slides here. So as you can see, so what's on the right here is what the registration certificate looks like. And so as far as the farm address, I had some concerns last year. What I typically do is the mailing address. That's the one that I'm typically given. So if you would prefer that it had the farm address, I'm more than happy to do that. But just as a blanket for me to be able to do it, I just do the mailing one, whichever one is listed on your registration form, because that's the easiest for me. This is your final confirmation that you've registered, someone has looked at it, didn't have any questions, and all of that. Once you get this, you're good to go. As far as when the registration starts, I just kind of wanted to give you, it could be up to a week, just because when November 1st hits, a lot of people are registering at that time. I try to keep on top of it, but it could take up to a week for it to get back to you, because I try to do it in batches just to make my life a little bit easier. So if you don't see it within a week, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to tell you where I am in the process. But if you filled it out, I can at least confirm I did receive your registration. I'm just maybe a little bit behind. So something that we also wanted to emphasize, that this is for registration only. It doesn't have anything to do with compliance on an inspection or compliance and enforcement at all. This registration certificate is strictly for the registration process and doesn't reflect anything, in the past or in the future with inspections. So just wanted to make sure that I was really clear on that this is just for registration, not for inspections. So of course, there's always exemptions to the rule, right? So here are the big ones that you will see, or you may have heard us talk about. So micro exempt, qualified exempt, commercial, and then discretionary. We're going to go into each one of these and what requirements there are with them. So the first one is micro exempt. What does a micro exempt farm mean? That means their sales average for the past 3 years is below 31,925. And I know that seems like a very specific number, but it goes up with inflation each year. This is a number that the FDA puts out every March, April time. So this is the number that we go off of. So if your 3-year sales average is below that, you'd be considered micro exempt. Anything above that sales threshold, that's when you get into being a fully covered farm, qualified, commercial, and all of that. And I'll go into more detail a little bit later. So if you're below that threshold, you don't have to be in compliance with the rule. However, like anything, it's always a good idea, right? Taking a PSA grower training gives you the foundation of what the rule is about. So that way you can start working towards those things instead of all of a sudden you're like, I'm no longer micro exempt. I may be inspected. I may have to be, I may be qualified exempt. What does this look like for me? It just eliminates a little bit of confusion, but then it also gives you confidence on this is our food safety practices. We're pretty much in line with what the produce safety rule says anyway. So going forward, you feel pretty comfortable about where your operation is at, right? We always encourage to be aware of that rule, right? Principles of food safety and what that compliance would look like once you're under the rule. As far as registration goes, micro exempt farms don't. However, we always encourage you to. Reason why, again, you get that newsletter. We have your contact information. So that way you're getting those industry updates. You're getting those regulatory updates, especially with the pre-harvest ag water part of the rule being finalized. There's going to be a lot of guidance documents, a lot of information coming out about that. So then that way you can kind of keep up with what is happening. So anything along those lines, again, industry information or webinars that we can provide for you, you would still be getting, right? And then, of course, grant opportunities as well. And then, of course, again, what we touched on with outbreaks. Even if you're micro exempt, your industry could be impacted. So having your information, we would be able to reach out to you if there's any extra steps or any precautions that we're aware of. We would be able to be in contact with you and kind of be able to work through that with you. All right, so here's the big one. So qualified exempt. With this one, you cannot be qualified exempt and micro exempt. So this one is when you are above that sales threshold and you can go down 2 different roads. You could be like a fully covered farm, so you wouldn't fall under any exemptions, or you could fall under qualified exempt. What does that mean? You would have to register because you're verifying and attesting to your qualified exempt status, and you have to do that on an annual basis. This is done through the registration. There's a question in the registration that asks this. And so then if you click yes, then you would have to fill out the qualified exempt form or the QE form, which is new this year. This is why we're having this webinar, just to get the word out. If you attest to that there's another part to your registration. The qualified exempt does not modify your record requirements, but it does modify as far as field inspections. So if you're qualified exempt, we could still do a record verification inspection. And if you don't have the record showing you're qualified exempt, we'll get into that, then you would be considered a fully covered farm and no longer exempt from that field inspection. So then, the inspector would want to see harvest activities, any packing activities, if you have a cooler, they'd want to see all of that. So just as an FYI, if you cannot attest to this, you'd be considered a fully covered farm, have to register and all of that. So qualified exempt. So it's your annual food sales. So the 500K was the first threshold number that was given in the rule. However, along with micro exempt, that sales threshold goes up each year. So it will be on November 1st, 638,491. It is one that gets adjusted with inflation. Notice how I bolded food sales. So with micro exempt, it was your produce sales. Now qualified exempt is your food. We'll get into what we mean in the next couple slides. Again, doesn't modify your record your record requirements and your record verifications. This is something that an inspector would be looking for. So, qualified end user / qualified exempt. So, 50% of your food is sold to a qualified end user. Notice it's food. So, what do we consider food? It'd be all these that are listed. So, if you do meat, if you have livestock, if you sell eggs, if you have chickens, right? Any poultry, anything along those lines. If you also sell jams, jellies, butters, apples, applesauce, anything along those lines, it would also fall under food sales. So if you kind of have your fingers in a lot of pots, this is something to consider, because there could be farms that are just a cover, maybe qualified exempt, but that food sales threshold is where they kind of start bumping up against, right? If you are in doubt, if all your food sales are below that $638,000 number, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be able to walk you through exactly what we would be wanting to see, because an inspector, if they're going to do a record verification, they'd be checking this. So just to kind of keep, just as an FYI. And then, so the 50% to a qualified end user. Well, what does that mean? So these are the ones that we consider a qualified end user. We're talking about the direct to end consumer. So if you're selling from your CSA through your farm, retail food establishments, restaurants, your farm at a farmer's market. However, I will asterisk this one. If you sell at the farmer's market to consumers, that counts. If you sell your produce to the farmer's market, then kind of pools resources and sells them as a bunch, that does not count. I know that there are a couple of farmers markets, specifically Boulder Farmers Market, I know does this. So kind of just be aware of that it's you selling, that there's no one else between you and who's consuming it. Also, if you have a roadside stand, that would count. So again, it's you to the consumer. The reason behind this is if there was to be anything that would happen, like an outbreak or anything, again, knock on wood, you would be able to call the people that were affected, is the main thing behind this. So that's why a qualified end user does not include, and this is the big one that the FDA had confirmed this year, if you're selling to a distribution center, it does not count. What do we mean by a distribution center? So typically, if you're selling into grocery stores, they count if you sell directly to a grocery store. You would have to show invoices proving that. While some of the smaller ones, like Whole Foods, I know has a distribution center in Denver. So if you're selling to them and then they're just, again, kind of pooling their resources and sending out to their stores, that doesn't count. The bigger one that I'm seeing more and more is school districts. So a lot of them, what they do is they have like a central hub where all the produce comes in, they cook it, they make the meals for the kids, and then sends them out to each of the individual schools. That does not count. If you sell to a specific school and can show an invoice from that specific school showing that it's not going to a centralized kitchen before it gets to the kids, that would count. So there are, as you can see with me just like describing that, there's a lot of gray, and there's just a lot of like really having to walk through all of that. So if you have any questions on if you're selling to a qualified end user, please let us know. We'd be able to walk you through that and what would and would not count. And then the other ones, if you wholesale, if you're selling bulk, that would not count. Or also if you're selling to a broker or a produce dealer or anything along those lines. Because again, there's someone between you and the produce and the consumer. So what does that mean for qualified exempt as far as registering with the program? So something new this year, because again, we wanted to make sure that those that are attesting to the qualified exempt, that they are actually qualified exempt. So you still have to register. There's a question that asks, do you sell exactly kind of what it was, like 50% of your sales are to qualified end users, below that 638. If you select during the registration process, then I or someone on staff will be reaching out to you to confirm that through a qualified exempt form. So then that way we can make sure our inventory is accurate, our aggregate data is accurate. And if you do not fill this out, we will consider you a covered farm because this is another step in the process and we'd be reaching out to you to confirm. So if we never receive that qualified exempt form, we consider you a fully covered farm. You would not be able to change that status until the following registration year, because again, you have to attest to this every year. So if you don't fill out a registration and then again, also then not filling in that qualified exempt form, you'd be considered a fully covered one. So what does it look like? So this is just the first page of it. So this is the qualified exemption form. On the second page is some like basic information, and then you're attesting to that, right? So again, just kind of covered this, right? So if you select yes, once you fill this in and send it back to us, we'll reconfirm that. And then the next step in the process is then you would get your registration certificate. So how the steps go: fill in your registration. If you clicked yes on the qualified exempt one, I or someone else would be reaching out to you to fill out the qualified exemption form. You would fill it in, send it back to us. We reconfirm, and then you get your registration certificate. Again, that's the last step. If you don't get that registration certificate, then reach out to us. There may be something that might have been missed. So that's, I know there, it sounds like a lot of steps, but this is just for us to re-verify that everyone who's saying they're qualified exempt is actually qualified exempt. Another one, commercial exempt. So again, this is one that you're above that sales threshold. You can't be commercial exempt and micro exempt. So it's all produce is going through a process to reduce pathogens. This is what the question looks like in the registration. So is your produce, all of it, going through a kill step? What do we consider a kill step? Winemaking is considered a kill step. Beer making is considered a kill step. But jams, jellies, sauces, tomato sauce, applesauce, ciders, butters, even anything where it's being boiled or processed into another state, that's what we're talking about. Now, where we've heard the most confusion is in a couple places, one of them being, oh, but I wash my lettuce, with water and a mixture of Sanidate. That's not a kill step. It's not considered a kill step under the rule. It's considered a really crucial step of cross-contamination. You're not killing the pathogens, you're just preventing them from spreading. So that's why we've seen a lot of confusion where people who have selected like leafy greens or something along those lines and have said, oh yeah, my stuff goes through a kill step, and it's like it hasn't under the rule. And it has to be all of your produce. So if you sell, a big example I can give you is like if you're selling peaches and you sell some, or you make some into, like a jam, but then you still sell them raw as well, that's not considered commercially exempt because it has to be all of them. But if all your peaches go through some, into a jam or jelly or butter, then that would. So what does that mean for you as far as registration goes? That means that you still have to register because, again, there's a question in the registration that asks, does your stuff go through a kill step? Again, we are wanting to make sure that we have the most accurate information. If you are commercially exempt, we want to make sure like, oh, they're not on our inspection list. We are fully aware that it's going through a kill step and then kind of move on, right? If you are doing wine grapes and wine grapes only, again, we know the winemaking process is a kill step, and we'll just update our database accordingly if we see that it's going through a commercial process. We'll kind of touch on the other ones a little bit down the line of what that looks like for like discretionary exempt and the other kill steps that you can do, or the other steps you can do. For discretionary exempt, since we just touched on wine grapes, there is a list for the produce safety rule that's the rarely consumed raw list. That list is exhaustive. Whatever's on that list that's not on that list is then considered under the rule. So there was 3 of them under the rule that people were like, but they go through a process, 2 of them you see here, wine grapes and hops. The other one's almonds. We don't grow almonds here, so I didn't include it, but they are all discretionary exempt because they're not on that rarely consumed raw list. So then they're automatically under the rule. So FDA does recognize that there's specific things that grapes or hops go through to reduce the risk of foodborne, illness, such as the winemaking process and the beer making process. So that's why it's under what we call discretionary exempt, or you might have even heard it called under enforcement discretion. So there are some modified requirements for this. You still have to register with the program. You have to have documents showing that your produce goes through a kill step, and you would not be subjected to an inspection. So that's kind of the steps with these. If this is something, if you have questions on this, I have another slide talking about, well, what if you do a mixture of things? Because it is quite confusing. So let's go there. So what if you do that? We see, especially on the Western Slope, a lot of farms have wine grapes, but then they also grow, peaches and plums and stuff like that. So if you do that, you would be considered under the rule. You would have to register. You wouldn't be considered commercially exempt because unless your other produce was going through a kill step besides your wine grapes, right? You would have to take that grower training. Any covered crops may be eligible for inspection, but again, you could be qualified exempt as well. So that is something to consider, but we would not be going into your vineyard. That is an area that we are not touching because, again, it's under enforcement discretion, discretionary exemption. So we will not be going into vineyards. But if you have orchards with pears and peaches and stuff like that, we would be. If you only grow wine grapes and something that's on that rarely consumed raw list, you would still have to register. You wouldn't be inspected by us. But also, again, if you click that commercial exempt, we can follow up with that as well, just to make sure that you have the proper records showing that it's going through a kill step. We did develop a flow chart because, again, this is a lot of information. It can be quite confusing. Well, I grow wine grapes and something else. What are my, what do I have to do in order to be compliant? I can share that with you. So that way you can walk it through each of your individual farms to find out, is this something that we need to follow? But high level, if you grow any produce, whether it's wine grapes or covered produce, you would have to at least bare minimum, at least register with the program and then have specific record requirements. So that is all I have. So this is our contact information. Again, I know I threw a bunch of information at you. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. But with that being said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I will ask if anyone has any questions.